The icy wind howled across the barren Nevada landscape, carrying with it the bitter chill of an unforgiving December night in 1882. Faith Burnham clutched her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, her trembling hands instinctively moving to protect the swollen belly that housed her unborn child. At 24, she found herself utterly alone, 6 months pregnant, and desperate for shelter as the temperature continued to plummet. Faith staggered through the main street of Tonopah Junction, Nevada, a small but growing mining town that had sprung up with the promise of silver and opportunity. The flickering glow of oil lamps from the windows offered a cruel reminder of the warmth she so desperately needed, but had been repeatedly denied. Her face was red from the cold, and her lips had begun to turn an alarming shade of blue. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind as she approached yet another door. This was the 5th establishment she had tried to night, a modest boarding house at the edge of town. The previous 4 attempts had ended with swift rejections, each one more cutting than the last. The door creaked open, revealing a stern-faced woman in her 50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Madam, I'm in desperate need of lodging," Faith began, her voice quivering. "Just for tonight." "I have some money." The woman's eyes dropped to Faith's prominent belly, and her expression hardened. "We don't take in your kind here," she said coldly. "This is a respectable establishment." "My kind," Faith echoed, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "Madam, I'm just seeking shelter for the night. The baby, I can see your condition plainly enough," the woman interrupted. "No husband, I presume, or is he conveniently elsewhere?" Her tone dripped with judgment. "We don't shelter fallen women. Try the saloon if you must, though even they have standards." The door slammed shut with a finality that sent Faith stumbling backward. She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat, fighting the overwhelming urge to collapse right there in the snow. 5 doors closed in her face in one night, all because she was unmarried and with child. Her vision blurred as she took unsteady steps back toward the main street. The snow was falling heavier now, coating her eyelashes and the thin shawl that provided little protection from the elements. Faith knew she wouldn't survive the night in this weather, not in her condition. Her baby wouldn't survive. In desperation, she turned toward the outskirts of town, where scattered homesteads stood as solitary beacons against the darkness. She had nothing left to lose. After what felt like hours, Faith spotted a small cabin set back from the road. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. With the last of her strength, she trudged through the deepening snow toward it, praying this would not be yet another door slammed in her face. Her knuckles were nearly frozen as she rapped weakly against the wooden door. For a long moment, there was no response, and Faith felt her hope dwindling. Then, the sound of footsteps approached, and the door swung open. A tall man stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light from inside. He wore a faded flannel shirt and worn denim trousers, with a gun belt hanging on a hook just within reach. His features were partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes, a startling shade of green, were alert and questioning as they took in the sight of her. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," Faith managed through chattering teeth, "but I've been turned away from every door in town. I have nowhere else to go." The man's gaze traveled from her face to her belly and back again. Faith braced herself for the judgment, the rejection that had become all too familiar. Instead, the man stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his deep voice carrying over the howling wind. "You're safe now." Faith hesitated, hardly believing what she was hearing. The man's expression softened as he reached out a hand to steady her. "Welcome home," he added quietly. Those 2 simple words broke something inside Faith. She stumbled forward, her frozen legs nearly giving out beneath her. The man caught her with strong, steady hands, guiding her inside the warm cabin and closing the door firmly against the raging storm outside. "I'm Garrett Galloway," he said, leading her to a chair by the fire. "And you look like you could use some hot food and a warm place to rest." "Faith," she whispered through trembling lips. "Faith Burnham, thank you. Thank you for not turning me away." "No one deserves to be left out in weather like this," Garrett replied, his voice matter of fact as he moved to stoke the fire. "Especially not in your condition." Faith watched him through tear-blurred eyes as he moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, heating a pot of stew that had been simmering over the fire and fetching a worn but clean blanket that he draped around her shoulders. "Eat," he encouraged, placing a steaming bowl in her hands. "Then we can talk if you're up to it." The stew was simple but hearty chunks of venison, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. Faith couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal, and her hands shook as she brought the spoon to her lips. "Slow now," Garrett cautioned. "Your stomach needs to adjust." As warmth gradually returned to her body, Faith became more aware of her surroundings. The cabin was modest but tidy, with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a collection of books neatly stacked on a shelf. A rifle stood propped in one corner, and various tools hung from hooks on the wall. It was the home of a man who lived simply but with purpose. "Are you a rancher?" Faith asked when she'd finished half the bowl. Garrett, who had been busying himself with various tasks to give her space, paused. "Was," he corrected. "Now I mostly hunt, trap, and do odd jobs around town. Got a few horses I train and sell when the opportunity arises." "Why did you let me in?" The question slipped out before Faith could stop it. "Everyone else in town." "I'm not everyone else," Garrett interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "And I don't much care what the town thinks is proper. No one should be turned away in a blizzard, least of all a woman expecting." Faith lowered her eyes, suddenly self-conscious of her prominent condition. "The father." She began, feeling she owed this kind stranger some explanation. Garrett held up a hand. "You don't need to explain anything to me, not tonight. Tonight you rest. There's time enough for stories later if you want to tell them." Tears welled in Faith's eyes again, but this time from gratitude rather than despair. "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "There's nothing to repay," Garrett said simply. "I've got a small room off the back. It's not much, just a cot and a chest of drawers, but it's yours for as long as you need it." "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing if you're invited," he said with a slight smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his rugged features, softening them and revealing a warmth that matched his actions. That night, as Faith lay on the surprisingly comfortable cot in the small back room, warm for the first time in weeks, she placed a hand on her swollen belly and felt her baby move within her. "We might be okay after all, little one," she whispered, as the storm raged outside but could no longer touch them. In the main room, Garrett Galloway sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver and pondering the strange turn his solitary life had taken with a single knock on his door. He glanced toward the room where the mysterious pregnant woman now slept, and felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. The blizzard continued through the night and well into the next day, blanketing Tonopah Junction in a thick layer of snow that forced even the most industrious citizens to remain indoors. For Faith, it was a blessing in disguise, a reprieve from having to face the town that had rejected her so thoroughly. She awoke to the scent of coffee and the sound of movement in the main room. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, but then the events of the previous night came rushing back. She was in the home of a stranger, a kind, taciturn cowboy who had offered shelter when no one else would. Faith's body ached as she rose from the cot. The journey to Tanapa Junction had been long and arduous, and the events of the previous night had pushed her already exhausted body to its limits. Still, she was alive, and so was her baby. That was more than she had dared hope for when the last door had closed in her face. She smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could, and attempted to bring some order to her tangled red-gold hair before venturing into the main room. Garrett stood at the small stove, his back to her, broad shoulders hunched slightly as he tended to something in a cast-iron skillet. He must have heard her approach, for he spoke without turning, the snow's still coming down. "Reckon we're stuck here for at least another day." He glanced over his shoulder, those green eyes briefly meeting hers. "Hope you like eggs and bacon. It's about all I have that's fit for breakfast." "That sounds wonderful," Faith replied, her voice still rough with sleep. "May I help with anything?" Garrett shook his head. "Sit. Rest. You need it more than I do." Faith reluctantly took a seat at the table, feeling awkward about being waited on. She'd spent most of her life in service to others, first as a daughter helping her parents run their small general store in Pennsylvania, then as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in St. Louis. The idea of sitting idle while someone else worked went against her nature. "I'm not an invalid," she said, with more force than she'd intended. "I may be expecting, but I'm perfectly capable of helping." Garrett turned fully to face her then, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. There's coffee there if you want to pour it. Cups are on the shelf." It was a small concession, but Faith accepted it gratefully, rising to fetch 2 cups and pour the strong, black coffee. She noticed Garrett watching her movements with a cautious eye, as though ready to step in if she showed any sign of weakness. "How far along are you?" he asked as he transferred eggs and bacon to 2 plates. "6 months, as best I can figure," Faith replied, setting the cups on the table. "The baby should come in early March." Garrett nodded, placing a plate before her and taking his own seat across the table. "And you're traveling alone?" "In winter." Faith stared down at her plate, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "I didn't have much choice," she said softly. "I couldn't stay where I was, and I had heard there were opportunities out west. Women who needed help with their households or businesses looking for respectable workers. Tanapa Junction isn't the easiest place for a woman alone," Garrett observed, "especially one in your condition." "I've discovered that," Faith said with a bitter smile. "I thought perhaps a growing town would be more accepting. I was wrong." Garrett was quiet for a moment, focusing on his food. "Most folks around here are decent enough," he finally said, "but they're set in their ways, traditional. They see a woman in your condition without a husband, and they make assumptions." "They're not wrong," Faith admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is no husband, not anymore." Garrett's eyes flickered up to meet hers, but there was no judgment in them, only a patient stillness that invited her to continue if she chose. Faith took a deep breath. This man had saved her life. He deserved some explanation. "I was married," she began. "His name was Thomas. We met in St. Louis, where I was working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. He was a clerk at a bank, educated and soft-spoken. We married quickly, too quickly, perhaps." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He changed after the wedding, became controlling, then cruel. When I found myself expecting, I thought perhaps it would soften him, that he might be happy about becoming a father. Instead, he became furious, accused me of trapping him. One night after he had been drinking, his anger turned physical." Faith's hand instinctively moved to touch a faint scar near her temple. "I feared for my life that night and for my babies. So when he left for work the next morning, I packed what I could carry and fled." I had a little money saved, enough for train fare west, but it ran out sooner than I expected. By the time I reached Tanapa Junction, I had just enough for a night's lodging, or so I thought. Garrett's expression had darkened during her tale, his jaw clenched tight. "This Thomas," he said, his voice low and controlled. "He know where you went?" Faith shook her head. "I doubt he even looked for me. More likely he told everyone I'd run off with another man, something to preserve his pride. I left no trail, took odd jobs along the way and used different names when I had to." "And now," Garrett asked, his tone gentler, "what's your plan?" Faith gave a humorless laugh. "I had hoped to find work here, to rent a small room somewhere until the baby came. After that." She shrugged helplessly. "I haven't thought that far ahead, just taking each day as it comes." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "You can stay here," he finally said, "until you figure out your next move. The town will settle down eventually, or at least find something new to gossip about." "I couldn't possibly impose on you like that," Faith protested, though the relief that flooded through her at his offer was overwhelming. "Like I said yesterday, it's not an imposition if you're invited." Garrett's tone was matter of fact. "Besides, I could use the help around here. Place could use a woman's touch, and I'm gone hunting most days anyway." Faith studied him, trying to discern his motives. In her experience, men rarely offered something for nothing. Yet there was something about Garrett Galloway that inspired trust. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, or the fact that he had opened his door when no one else would. "Why are you helping me?" she asked directly. "You don't know me." Garrett's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, Faith glimpsed a shadow of old pain beneath his steady gaze. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need help and not get it," he said quietly. "I don't aim to be the kind of person who turns away someone in need." There was more to the story, Faith was certain, but she recognized that Garrett, like her, had his boundaries. She would respect them just as he had respected hers. "Thank you," she said simply. "I accept your offer, and I'll earn my keep, I promise you that." Garrett nodded once, seeming satisfied with the arrangement. "Storm should break by tomorrow. Once the snow stops, I'll head into town for supplies. Is there anything you need?" Faith thought of all the things she had left behind in her flight from St. Louis, clothes that would fit her changing body, personal items, the small comforts that made life bearable. "Perhaps some fabric if it's not too expensive. I can sew a few things for myself, and maybe spruce up this place a bit, like you said." "Consider it done," Garrett said, rising from the table and taking his empty plate to the wash basin. "Now I'd best tend to the horses. They get restless in weather like this." As he donned his heavy coat and prepared to brave the short walk to the small stable attached to the cabin, Faith cleared the table, her mind whirling with the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been on the verge of freezing to death, rejected and alone. Now she had shelter, food, and the promise of safety, all because this solitary cowboy had chosen kindness when others had not. For the first time in months, Faith felt a fragile hope beginning to bloom within her heart. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the third day. Faith awoke to sunlight streaming through the small window of her room, the brightness nearly blinding after the gray gloom that had persisted during the storm. She could hear Garrett moving about in the main room, the familiar sounds of his morning routine already becoming comforting to her. The past 2 days had established a tentative rhythm between them. Garrett had given Faith space and privacy, sleeping on a bedroll near the fire while she took the small room. They shared meals and occasional conversation, but largely existed in a companionable silence that suited them both. Faith had begun to tidy the cabin, careful not to overstep or rearrange too much, mindful that this was his home. Garrett had seemed pleased with her subtle touches, the more organized shelves, the freshly swept floors, the mended shirt she had found with a torn sleeve. Now, as Faith dressed in the same worn dress she'd arrived in, she heard the front door open and close. Peering through the window, she saw Garrett trudging through the knee-deep snow toward the stable, no doubt preparing to ride into town as he had promised. By the time Faith emerged from her room, Garrett was back inside, pulling on a heavier coat and checking his gun belt. "Morning," he greeted her, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'm heading into town for supplies. Anything else you need besides the fabric we talked about?" Faith hesitated, then reached for her small coin purse. "If you could perhaps find some hairpins, and maybe soap the kind that doesn't smell like lye, I can pay for it," she added quickly, opening the purse to reveal her meager savings. Garrett shook his head. "Put that away. Consider it part of the supplies we need for the cabin." "Garrett, I can't let you." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You're working for your keep, aren't you? Cooking, cleaning, mending, that's worth something." Faith slowly put the purse away, touched by his consideration but uncomfortable with his generosity. "At least let me pay you back when I can find work." A shadow crossed Garrett's face. "About that," he said, adjusting his hat, "you should know that word has likely spread about you by now. Tanapa Junction isn't big enough for secrets, and someone would have seen you trying those doors the other night. It might be difficult for you to find regular employment in town." Faith's heart sank. She had feared as much, but hearing it confirmed made it painfully real. "I see," she said quietly. "Then perhaps I should move on once the roads are passable. Carson City, maybe, or—" "That's not what I'm suggesting," Garrett cut in. "Just be prepared for the reception you might get. This town can be hard on outsiders, especially those who don't fit their notion of propriety." "And what about you?" Faith asked, suddenly curious. "You seem to be an outsider yourself, living out here away from town. Why is that?" Garrett's expression closed off slightly. "That's a story for another time," he said. "I should get going if I want to make it back before dark. The snow's deep, and Drum Creek might be running high with the melt." Faith nodded, accepting that Garrett, too, had parts of himself he wasn't ready to share. "Be careful," she said softly. A ghost of a smile touched Garrett's lips. "Always am," he replied, and then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Left alone in the cabin, Faith set about continuing her work. There was bread to bake, floors to scrub, and she had discovered a pile of clothes in need of mending the day before. The physical tasks helped keep her mind from dwelling too much on her precarious situation and uncertain future. By midday, the cabin was filled with the homey scent of fresh bread, and Faith had made significant progress on the mending. Her back ached from the combination of her advanced pregnancy and the hours of labor, so she settled into the chair by the fire to rest for a moment. Her hand moved automatically to her belly as the baby kicked vigorously. "You're restless today," she murmured. "Perhaps you're as eager as I am for a change of scenery." The solitude gave her time to reflect on her unexpected rescuer. Garrett Galloway was a puzzle, a man who lived apart from society, yet clearly knew its workings intimately. He was rough-edged but gentle, taciturn but thoughtful. And there was a sadness about him, a weight he carried that Faith recognized because she carried one of her own. She was still pondering these thoughts when the sound of approaching hoofbeats alerted her to Garrett's return. Peering through the window, she saw him dismounting from his sturdy bay gelding, weighted down with supplies. Faith hurried to the door to help him. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said, reaching for one of the bags he carried. "Roads were better than I thought," Garrett replied, handing her a lighter bundle while keeping the heavier ones for himself. "Snow's already melting in town." As they brought the supplies inside, Faith noticed that Garrett seemed tense, his movements more abrupt than usual. Once everything was set on the table, he turned to face her. "There's talk in town," he said without preamble, "about you." Faith's stomach clenched. "What kind of talk?" "The kind you'd expect," Garrett replied grimly. "A woman in your condition staying out here with a man who's not her husband. Some are saying I've taken up with a fallen woman." Faith's cheeks burned with shame and anger. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never meant to bring scandal to your door." "Perhaps it would be better if you what?" Garrett interrupted, his green eyes flashing. "Headed back out into the wilderness. Tried your luck in another town that might be just as judgmental. No, that's not the answer." "Then what is?" Faith asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I won't be the cause of you being ostracized. You've been too kind for me to repay you like that." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Faith had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "The way I see it, we have a few options. You could go, like you said, though I don't recommend it. You could stay, and we could both ignore the talk. It'll die down eventually. Or—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Or," Faith prompted. "Or we could give them something else to talk about," Garrett said slowly. "Something that would make your presence here respectable in their eyes." Faith's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand." Garrett took a deep breath. "We could tell them we're married." Faith stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Married." "But we're not." "I know that," Garrett said quickly. "But they don't. It would just be a story, something to protect your reputation and give you time to figure out your next steps without the town turning against you." Faith couldn't find words to respond. The suggestion was outlandish, yet undeniably practical. A pretend marriage would indeed shield her from the worst of the town's judgment, would explain her presence in Garrett's cabin, would provide a respectable cover for her condition. I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You don't need to decide right now," Garrett assured her. "It's just an idea, think about it." Faith nodded slowly, her mind racing. "And what about you? What would you get out of such an arrangement?" Garrett's expression was unreadable. "Peace of mind knowing you and your child are safe," he said simply. "And maybe a bit less solitude than I'm used to. It gets quiet out here sometimes." There was more to it than that, Faith suspected, but Garrett's motivation seemed genuinely benevolent. Still, the idea of claiming to be married, even as a pretense, felt like a significant step. "I'll think about it," she promised. Garrett nodded, seeming satisfied with her response. "I almost forgot," he said, reaching for one of the bundles on the table. "I got the things you asked for, and a few extras I thought you might need." Faith unwrapped the package to find not only the fabric she had requested but also a set of hairpins, a bar of lavender-scented soap, a new comb, and a small bottle of rose water. Beneath these treasures was a folded garment that, when she lifted it, revealed itself to be a dress simple but well-made, with enough room to accommodate her growing belly. "Garrett," she breathed, running her fingers over the soft blue fabric. "This is too much." "The dress was Sarah Jenkins's idea," Garrett said, a hint of embarrassment coloring his tone. "She runs the mercantile with her husband, said you'd need something proper to wear when you came to town. She's got a good heart, even if her tongue can be sharp sometimes. You told her about me?" Faith asked, surprised. "Just that I had a woman staying with me who needed some things," Garrett clarified. "She figured out the rest on her own. Sarah's one of the few in town who doesn't spend her time gossiping. She's also a midwife, which might come in handy for you in a couple of months." Faith held the dress against herself, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of both Garrett and this unknown woman who had chosen kindness over judgment. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Garrett shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing," he muttered. "I'd better tend to the horse." As he headed back outside, Faith remained standing by the table, the new dress still clutched in her hands, her mind turning over Garrett's unexpected proposal. A pretend marriage would solve many problems, but it would also create new complications, tying her life to this enigmatic man's in ways she hadn't anticipated. Yet as she looked around the cabin that was rapidly becoming a home to her, Faith couldn't help but feel that perhaps this strange twist of fate was offering her something she had never expected to find again after fleeing from Thomas: a second chance. The next 2 weeks brought a noticeable thaw, both in the weather and in the tentative relationship between Faith and Garrett. The snow receded, revealing patches of brown earth and hardy winter grasses. Garrett's daily hunting excursions became more productive as game emerged from their winter hideaways, and Faith found herself busy preserving meat, tending to the small stores of vegetables Garrett had put away for winter, and continuing to bring order to the cabin. They had settled into a comfortable routine, sharing meals and occasionally stories, though Garrett remained reticent about his past. Faith learned that he had been in Tonopah Junction for nearly 5 years, that he had once worked cattle on a large ranch near Ely, and that he possessed an unexpected knowledge of literature evidenced by the well-worn books on his shelves, which he occasionally quoted from memory. As for Garrett's proposal, they had not discussed it further, though it lingered in the air between them, an unresolved question that would eventually need answering. Faith found herself studying Garrett when he wasn't looking, trying to imagine what it would be like to claim him as a husband, even in pretense. He was not conventionally handsome like Thomas had been, but there was a rugged appeal to his features, a strength and steadiness that Faith found increasingly attractive. More compelling than his physical appearance was his character. Garrett was unfailingly considerate, respecting Faith's privacy and independence while ensuring she had everything she needed. He never pressed her for details about her past that she wasn't ready to share, and he took evident satisfaction in her growing comfort in his home. One crisp afternoon in early January, Garrett returned from town with news that the stagecoach had finally made it through from Carson City, bringing mail and supplies that had been delayed by the blizzard. Among the items he brought back was a newspaper, which he handed to Faith with an apologetic expression. "Thought you might like to catch up on the world outside," he said. "Though I warn you, most of the news is at least 2 weeks old." Faith accepted the paper gratefully. It had been months since she'd had access to news from beyond her immediate surroundings. As she scanned the pages, a small item in the notices section caught her eye and made her blood run cold, seeking information regarding the whereabouts of Mrs. Faith Burnham née Collins, who disappeared from St. Louis, Missouri in October. Fair complexion, red gold hair, green eyes, approximately 5'5" in height, maybe in a delicate condition. Her husband, Thomas Burnham, offers a reward for information leading to her safe return. Contact T. Burnham at First Bank of St. Louis. Faith's hands trembled so violently that the paper rustled audibly. Garrett, who had been sorting through other supplies, looked up sharply. "Faith, what is it?" She couldn't speak, could only hold out the paper with a shaking finger pointed at the notice. Garrett took it from her, his brow furrowed as he read, his expression darkened with each word. "He's looking for me," Faith whispered, finding her voice at last. "After all this time, he's looking for me." "It might not mean anything," Garrett said, though his tone lacked conviction. "These notices get placed in papers all over the country. Chances are slim it would lead him here specifically." "But what if it does?" Faith's voice rose with panic. "What if someone recognizes me from the description? What if they write to him? He'll come for me, Garrett. Not because he cares, but because I humiliated him by leaving. He can't abide being made to look the fool. Garrett's jaw tightened. He won't find you, he said firmly. And if he does, he'll have to go through me to get to you. His protective declaration should have been comforting, but it only heightened Faith's anxiety. I can't put you in that position, she said, rising from her chair with difficulty due to her advanced pregnancy. This is my problem, not yours. Perhaps I should move on, go somewhere even more remote. No. Garrett's voice was like iron. Running isn't the answer, Faith, not anymore. Then what is? She challenged, tears of frustration and fear welling in her eyes. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I think, he said slowly, it's time we revisited our earlier conversation. Faith knew immediately what he meant. The pretend marriage, she said. Yes, but not pretend, Garrett replied, his voice steady despite the significance of what he was suggesting. Real. Faith stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. Real? I mean a legal marriage, Garrett confirmed. Recorded in the church registry, witnessed and signed. Not just a story we tell, but a binding agreement that would protect you legally if Thomas Burnham ever did track you down. Garrett, Faith breathed, shocked by the proposal. You can't possibly, we hardly know each other. I know enough, he interrupted. I know you're kind and hardworking. I know you're brave enough to flee a dangerous situation to protect yourself and your child. I know we get along well enough day to day. And I know that, as your legal husband, I would have the right to send Thomas Burnham packing if he ever showed his face around here. Faith sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the suggestion. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, she said softly. I've made that mistake once already. I'm not suggesting we rush to the church today, Garrett clarified. Just that we consider it as a solution. We could set terms, understand what each of us expects. It would be a marriage of convenience, but a real one nonetheless. And what would you expect? Faith asked, needing to understand his motivations. Garrett seemed to choose his words carefully. Companionship, he said finally. Someone to share this place with, to help make it a home rather than just a cabin. I've been alone a long time, Faith. It suited me for a while, but lately. He trailed off, then shrugged. I'd treat you well, and I'd treat your child as my own. Faith's heart twisted at his words. The proposal was practical, even sensible, yet there was something more beneath it, a loneliness that matched her own, a desire for connection that went beyond mere convenience. And what about? Faith hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. What about the more intimate aspects of marriage? Garrett's expression remained steady, though a faint color appeared high on his cheekbones. That would be entirely up to you, he said quietly. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. The honesty and respect in his response moved Faith deeply. Here was a man who, unlike Thomas, understood that she was not a possession to be claimed but a person with her own will and desires. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Garrett nodded. Take all the time you need, he replied. The offer stands. That night, as Faith lay in her small room, her hands resting on her swollen belly, she weighed the unexpected proposal against her limited options. Marriage to Garrett would provide security, respectability, and protection for both her and her child. It would shield her from Thomas's pursuit and from the judgment of the townspeople. And Garrett himself, while still somewhat of a mystery, had proven himself to be a kind and honorable man. Yet marriage was a serious commitment, especially in these remote territories where divorce was difficult and scandalous. If she accepted Garrett's offer, she would be binding herself to him in a way that would not be easily undone. The baby kicked vigorously, as if offering its own opinion on the matter. What do you think, little one? Faith whispered. Should we take a chance on Garrett Galloway? As if in response, the baby kicked again, Directly under her palm, Faith smiled into the darkness. Perhaps it was time to stop running and start building something new: a life, a family, a home. And perhaps Garrett Galloway, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness, was exactly the partner she needed for such an endeavor. By morning, she had made her decision. Garrett was already up and preparing breakfast when Faith emerged from her room, her face calm and resolved. He glanced up as she entered, his expression questioning. "Good morning," he said cautiously, clearly sensing that something had changed. "Good morning," Faith replied, taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your proposal." Garrett set down the coffee pot he'd been holding, giving her his full attention. And I think. Faith met his gaze steadily. "I think I would like to accept if the offer still stands." The tension in Garrett's shoulders visibly released. "It does," he confirmed. "You're sure about this?" Faith nodded. "As sure as I can be, but I do have some conditions." "Name them," Garrett said, gesturing for her to sit at the table with him. Faith settled into the chair, gathering her thoughts. "First, I want to be clear that this is a partnership," she began. "I won't be treated as property or as someone less than equal." "Agreed," Garrett said without hesitation. "This would be a true partnership in every sense." "Second, I want your promise that you'll treat this child as your own, regardless of its parentage." Garrett's expression softened. "That's an easy promise to make," he said quietly. "Any child in my home will be my child in every way that matters." Faith felt a weight lift from her heart at his words. "And third," she continued, "I want honesty between us. No secrets that could harm our arrangement. If either of us feels this isn't working, we discuss it openly." Garrett nodded slowly. "Honesty," he repeated. "That's fair. And in the spirit of honesty, there are things about my past you should know before you commit to this." Faith waited, sensing that whatever Garrett was about to share was significant. "I was married before," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Her name was Alina. We had a small ranch near Ely, nothing fancy, but it was ours. She was expecting our first child when a fever swept through the area. I was away delivering horses to a buyer in Carson City when I returned." His voice faltered slightly. "She was gone, both of them." "Garrett," Faith breathed, her heart aching for him. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head as if warding off her sympathy. "It was 5 years ago. After I couldn't bear to stay at the ranch, too many memories. So I sold it, drifted for a while, then settled here. Been alone ever since." Faith understood now why he had been so quick to offer her shelter, why the sight of her pregnant and desperate had moved him to compassion when others had turned away. She represented a second chance for him, just as he did for her. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "It helps me understand you better." Garrett's eyes met hers, vulnerability visible in their green depths for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "I want you to know that I'm not looking to replace Alina," he said. "What we had was special, but it's part of my past. What I'm proposing with you is something new, different, but no less real." Faith reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, placed her hand over his. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. "I understand," she said. "I'm not looking to replace what I thought I had with Thomas, either. That dream died long before I left St. Louis." Garrett turned his hand beneath hers, gripping her fingers gently. "So we're agreed?" he asked. "We do this," Faith nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the momentous decision. "We do this," she confirmed. "Partners." "Partners," Garrett echoed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then I suppose we should make arrangements with Reverend Galloway. Sunday after services would be traditional." Faith's eyes widened. "This Sunday, that's only 3 days away." "Is that too soon?" Garrett asked, concern evident in his voice. "We can wait if you prefer." Faith considered the question, with Thomas potentially searching for her and the town already gossiping about her presence in Garrett's cabin. Delay served little purpose. No, she decided. Sunday is fine, though I have nothing suitable to wear except the blue dress you brought me. The blue dress will be perfect, Garrett assured her. And afterward we can have a small gathering here if you like. Nothing fancy, but a few of the decent folks from town might come if invited. The idea of a wedding celebration, however modest, warmed Faith's heart. Her first marriage had been a rushed affair at the courthouse, with only Thomas's disinterested parents as witnesses. There had been no celebration, no acknowledgement of the significance of the commitment they were making. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A new beginning deserves to be celebrated." Garrett's smile widened, transforming his usually solemn features. "Then it's settled. I'll ride into town today to speak with the Reverend and extend some invitations." As Garrett prepared to leave, Faith found herself filled with a cautious optimism she hadn't experienced in months. This unusual arrangement, a marriage of convenience with a man she had known for less than a month, somehow felt right in a way her first marriage never had, despite its traditional beginnings. Perhaps, she thought, watching Garrett saddle his horse through the cabin window, real love wasn't about romantic poetry and passionate declarations, but about small kindnesses, mutual respect, and the courage to build something new from the ashes of past disappointments. Only time would tell if she was right. Sunday dawned clear and crisp, the winter sun casting long shadows across the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Faith stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the blue dress that now fit her perfectly thanks to her own skillful alterations. She had pinned her hair up as elegantly as she could manage with the limited supplies available, and had even dabbed a touch of the rose water Garrett had brought her behind her ears. Her reflection showed a woman transformed from the desperate, bedraggled creature who had arrived on Garrett's doorstep during the blizzard. Though still visibly pregnant, nearly 7 months now, her cheeks had filled out, and there was a healthy glow to her skin that came from regular meals and peaceful sleep. More significant than the physical changes, however, was the look in her eyes. The haunted fear had been replaced by cautious hope. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Faith," Garrett's voice came through the wood. "The wagon's ready when you are. Service starts in an hour." "I'll be right out," she called, taking one last look at herself in the mirror. Today she would become Mrs. Galloway. The name felt strange in her mind, yet not unwelcome. Faith Galloway. A new identity to match her new beginning. When she emerged from the room, Faith found Garrett waiting by the door, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes: clean dark trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a black vest. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and though he still looked rugged, there was an undeniable handsomeness to him that made Faith's breath catch. Garrett, for his part, seemed equally affected by the sight of her. His eyes widened slightly, and he cleared his throat before speaking. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Faith felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you," she replied. "You look quite handsome yourself." A hint of color appeared on Garrett's tanned face, and he ducked his head in acknowledgement. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm. The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the step they were about to take. Faith watched the landscape pass by, the snow-covered hills giving way to the scattered buildings of Tonopah Junction. She felt a flutter of anxiety as they approached the small white church at the edge of town, remembering the rejection she had faced on her first night here. Garrett seemed to sense her unease. "It'll be all right," he said quietly, helping her down from the wagon. "Not everyone in town is judgmental, and those who are will come around eventually. once they see you're a decent woman." Faith squeezed his arm gratefully as he escorted her toward the church doors. The Sunday service was already underway, the congregation's voices raised in a familiar hymn. Garrett led her to a pew near the back, and they slipped in as unobtrusively as possible, though Faith was aware of several heads turning in their direction. Reverend Galloway, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, acknowledged their presence with a slight nod but continued with the service. Faith tried to focus on the sermon, something about compassion and judgment, but found her thoughts continually returning to the ceremony that would follow. Was she doing the right thing? Marrying a man she barely knew, binding her future to his. Yet as she glanced sideways at Garrett, his profile strong and steady as he listened to the Reverend's words, Faith felt a certainty that had been absent from her first marriage, despite its more conventional beginnings. When the service concluded, most of the congregation filed out, though a small group remained behind Sarah Jenkins and her husband from the Mercantile. A few ranch hands Faith didn't recognize, and an elderly couple who smiled kindly at her as Garrett led her forward to the altar. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Galloway began, his voice warm and resonant, "we gather today to witness the union of Garrett Galloway and Faith Burnham in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and brief, with traditional vows that nonetheless felt weighted with significance as Faith and Garrett exchanged them. When they reached the moment for the ring, Garrett surprised Faith by producing a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. "I hope you don't mind." Faith felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected gesture. "It's perfect," she whispered back. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Galloway concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Garrett, you may kiss your bride." There was a moment of hesitation. They hadn't discussed this part. Then Garrett leaned forward and placed a gentle, chaste kiss on Faith's lips. It was brief but undeniably sweet, and Faith felt a surprising warmth spread through her at the contact. As they turned to face their small group of witnesses, now officially husband and wife, Faith was struck by the strange path that had led her to this moment. 4 weeks ago, she had been desperate and alone, convinced that her life held nothing but struggle and hardship. Now she stood beside a man who had opened not just his door but his life to her, offering protection and partnership when she needed it most. The small reception at the cabin that afternoon was modest but cheerful. Sarah Jenkins had brought a cake, and someone else contributed a bottle of decent whiskey. There was laughter and conversation, and Faith found herself welcomed with unexpected warmth by the handful of townspeople who had chosen to attend. "You've done wonders with the place already," Sarah commented as she helped Faith serve coffee. "It was a bachelor's hovel when I saw it last." Faith smiled, pleased by the acknowledgement of her efforts. "It just needed a woman's touch," she said. "Garrett had the essentials, but not much in the way of comforts." "He's a good man," Sarah said, her tone more serious. "Keeps to himself mostly, but always ready to help when needed. Lost his first wife in a terrible way, but I suppose he told you about that." Faith nodded. "He did." Sarah studied her thoughtfully. "It's not my place to pry, but I hope you know what you're doing, marrying so quickly, especially in your condition." "I know it seems unusual," Faith admitted, "but sometimes the right decision doesn't follow the conventional path." Sarah seemed satisfied with this answer. "Well, you both have my support for what it's worth. And when your time comes," she added with a significant glance at Faith's belly, "send Garrett for me. I've helped bring more babies into this world than I can count." Faith thanked her sincerely, grateful for the offer of assistance and the lack of judgment behind it. As the afternoon wore on and the guests gradually departed, Faith found herself increasingly aware of the new reality she had entered. This cabin was now officially her home, and Garrett, this man she was still coming to know, was now her husband. When the last guest had gone and they were alone together, a brief awkwardness descended between them. Garrett busied himself clearing away glasses while Faith wrapped leftover cake in a clean cloth. "Was it what you hoped for?" Garrett asked after a while, breaking the silence. Faith considered the question. "Yes," she said honestly. "It was simple but meaningful. Thank you for arranging it." Garrett nodded, seeming pleased by her answer. Then, with characteristic directness, he addressed the elephant in the room. "About the sleeping arrangements," he began. "I can continue on the bedroll by the fire if you prefer." Faith had been pondering this question herself. They were legally married now, but their arrangement had begun as one of convenience and protection. Still, something had shifted between them during the ceremony, a connection that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there but unacknowledged. "The bed is large enough for both of us," she said carefully. "And winter nights are cold. I think we could share it if you're comfortable with that. Just for sleeping," she added quickly. Garrett's expression was unreadable for a moment, then he nodded. "If you're sure," he said. "I promise to be a gentleman." Faith smiled, appreciating his respect for her boundaries. "I know you will," she replied. "That's why I'm comfortable suggesting it." That night, as they lay side by side in the darkness, a respectful distance between them on the bed that was indeed large enough for two, Faith found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From a desperate woman on the brink of freezing to death to a married woman with a home and a future, all in the span of a month. "Garrett," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. "Hum?" His deep voice rumbled in the darkness. "Thank you for everything." There was a pause, then she felt his hand find hers beneath the blankets, his rough fingers entwining with her softer ones. "Thank you for staying," he replied simply. In that quiet moment of connection, Faith felt something new take root within her heart, not the desperate, all-consuming passion she had once mistaken for love with Thomas, but something steadier and more profound. A foundation upon which something real and lasting might be built. As February gave way to March, the weather began to warm, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring. The snow receded, revealing patches of earth that would soon sprout with new growth. Inside the cabin, a different kind of growth was taking place, the gradual deepening of the bond between Faith and Garrett as they navigated their unusual marriage. They had settled into a comfortable routine, sharing the work of the homestead according to their abilities. Garrett handled the hunting, trapping, and heavier chores, while Faith maintained the cabin, cooked their meals, and tended to the small garden plot she had begun preparing for spring planting. They worked well together, their partnership becoming more natural with each passing day. The physical aspects of their relationship had progressed slowly, respectfully. What had begun as a practical sharing of the bed had evolved into a comfortable closeness. Garrett's arm draped protectively over Faith during the night, her head sometimes resting on his shoulder in the morning. Occasionally, there were chaste kisses upon leaving for a hunting trip or returning safely home, in gratitude for a special meal or a thoughtful gesture. Nothing more had been discussed or attempted, both of them tacitly agreeing to let their physical relationship develop at its own pace. As Faith's pregnancy advanced into its final weeks, her movements became more labored, and Garrett took on additional household tasks without being asked, anticipating her needs with a sensitivity that continually surprised and touched her. He fashioned a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and lining it with soft fabric that Sarah Jenkins had contributed. He even rode all the way to Carson City to procure a set of baby clothes and a special tonic the doctor there recommended for women in the final stages of pregnancy. Faith found herself watching Garrett when he wasn't looking, studying the man who had so unexpectedly become her husband. She noted the gentle way he spoke to the horses, the careful precision with which he cleaned his rifle, the quiet concentration on his face as he rode by lamplight in the evenings. He was still something of a mystery in many ways, but a mystery she was gradually unraveling, one day at a time. For his part, Garrett seemed increasingly content with their arrangement. The perpetual tension he had carried in his shoulders when Faith first met him had eased, and he smiled more readily now, a transformation that made him almost handsome in Faith's eyes. He had even begun accompanying her to Sunday services in town, where the initial whispers and stares had gradually given way to acceptance, if not outright warmth. On a mild evening in mid-March, as they sat together on the small porch Garrett had built onto the front of the cabin, Faith felt the first real contraction seize her body. She gasped, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Garrett was immediately alert. "Is it time?" he asked, setting aside the knife he had been sharpening. Faith nodded, trying to keep her breathing steady as the contraction passed. "I think so," she said. "But it could be hours yet. First babies often take their time, from what I've heard." Despite her calm words, Garrett sprang into action. He helped Faith inside and made her comfortable on the bed, then prepared to ride for Sarah Jenkins as they had planned. "I'll be back as quickly as I can," he promised, pausing at the door. There was concern in his eyes, but something else too, a vulnerability Faith had rarely seen from him. "You'll be all right until then." Faith managed a smile through another contraction. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "This is natural, Garrett. Women have been doing it since the beginning of time." He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Still," he said, "I wish I didn't have to leave you." "The sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back with Sarah," Faith pointed out practically. With a final concerned glance, Garrett was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance as he urged his horse to speed. Left alone, Faith focused on her breathing as the contractions continued, gradually increasing in frequency and intensity. She thought about the child who would soon enter the world, Thomas's child by blood, but Garrett's by choice and commitment. She wondered what kind of father Garrett would be, though deep down, she already knew. He would be steadfast and loving, firm but fair, everything Thomas would not have been. By the time Garrett returned with Sarah Jenkins, Faith's labor had progressed significantly. Sarah took charge with calm efficiency, sending Garrett to heat water and prepare clean linens while she examined Faith. "You're doing well," Sarah assured her. "The baby is positioned correctly and you're already halfway there. This little one is eager to meet the world." The hours that followed were a blur of pain, effort, and encouragement. Sarah's experienced hands guided the process, while Garrett, to Faith's surprise, refused to leave her side. He held her hand through each contraction, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and murmured words of support and admiration. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her as the labor reached its peak. "You can do this, Faith. I'm right here with you." Just as dawn was breaking, with a final, tremendous effort, Faith brought her child into the world. The baby's indignant cry filled the cabin, a sound so perfect it brought tears to Faith's eyes. "It's a boy," Sarah announced, quickly wrapping the infant in a clean cloth. "A healthy, strong boy." Faith held out her arms, and Sarah placed the tiny bundle against her chest. She looked down at her son's red, scrunched face, overcome with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Garrett," she whispered, looking up at the man who stood beside her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Would you like to meet your son?" Garrett's expression as he gazed down at the baby was one Faith would never forget, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and something that looked remarkably like love. Carefully, as though handling the most precious thing in the world, he reached out to touch the infant's tiny hand. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Later, after Sarah had helped clean up and departed with promises to check in the next day, Faith and Garrett sat together on the bed, marveling at the perfect being they now shared responsibility for. "What shall we call him?" Garrett asked, watching as the baby nursed contentedly. Faith had been pondering this question for months. She had initially thought to name the child after her father. But now, looking at the man beside her, the man who had opened his door when others had closed theirs, who had offered protection and partnership when she needed it most, she knew there was only one right choice. "I'd like to name him Gabriel," she said softly, "after your father." Garrett had mentioned once in passing that his father had been named Gabriel, a good man who had taught him everything he knew about horses and honor. Garrett's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Faith nodded, reaching out to take his hand. "You've given us so much," she said. "A home, security, your name. It seems only fitting that he should carry something of you with him always." Garrett was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on their joined hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Gabriel Galloway," he said, trying out the name. "It's a strong name, a good name." "For a good man's son," Faith said softly, and she wasn't speaking of Thomas. Garrett's eyes met hers again, and in them, Faith saw something that made her heart skip a beat, a depth of feeling that went beyond their practical arrangement, beyond partnership and convenience. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Garrett leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike the chaste peck they had shared at their wedding, this kiss was gentle but deliberate, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Faith found herself breathless in a way that had nothing to do with her recent labor. "I didn't plan for this," Garrett admitted, his hand still cradling her face. "When I offered you shelter that night, when I suggested this marriage, I didn't expect to feel." "I know," Faith whispered. "Neither did I." Between them, little Gabriel made a contented sound as if approving of this new development. "We'll take it slow," Garrett promised, his thumb gently caressing her cheek. "There's no rush," Faith nodded, grateful for his understanding. She was still healing, still adjusting to motherhood, still learning to trust again after Thomas's betrayal. Yet she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her at Garrett's touch, the sense of rightness she felt in his arms. "We have time," she agreed, and they did. Time to let their arranged marriage transform into something real and lasting. Time to build a life together in this small cabin that had become a true home. Time to watch Gabriel grow, perhaps alongside brothers and sisters of his own. Time to discover that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful destinations. As spring blossomed fully across the Nevada landscape, bringing wildflowers and new growth to the hills surrounding their home, Faith found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past 6 months. From the desperate night she had staggered through a blizzard, turned away from every door in Tonopah Junction, to this peaceful morning, sitting on the porch with Gabriel nestled in her arms while Garrett mended a fence nearby. Gabriel was thriving, a robust 3-month-old with Garrett's green eyes, a coincidence that often made Faith smile, as if nature itself approved of their unusual family arrangement. He had a hearty appetite and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met him, from Sarah Jenkins, who visited regularly, to the initially skeptical townspeople who had gradually warmed to Faith's presence among them. And then there was Garrett. Their relationship had continued to evolve in ways Faith could never have anticipated when she accepted his proposal of a marriage of convenience. What had begun as a practical partnership had blossomed into something far more profound. The gentle kiss they had shared on the day of Gabriel's birth had been the first of many, each one deepening the connection between them. Garrett was still a man of few words, but he had found other ways to express his growing feelings for Faith in the wildflowers he brought her from his hunting trips, in the way he held her close at night, in his patient teaching as they worked side by side to expand their garden and improve their home, and in his unwavering devotion to Gabriel, whom he treated with all the love and pride of a natural father. Faith was pulled from her reflections by the sight of Garrett approaching, wiping his brow in the midday sun. He smiled at the picture she made with Gabriel, a smile that still made her heart flutter after all these months. "How are my two favorite people?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch step. "Enjoying the sunshine," Faith replied, shifting Gabriel so Garrett could see his face. "I think he likes watching the birds in that cottonwood tree." Garrett reached out to stroke the baby's cheek with one finger, his touch impossibly gentle for a man with such work-roughened hands. Gabriel cooed in response, his tiny fingers curling reflexively around Garrett's thumb. "I was thinking," Garrett said after a moment, his eyes still on Gabriel. "We should take a trip into Carson City next week. There are some supplies we need that Sarah can't get in her shop." Faith nodded, though she sensed there was more to the suggestion. "Is there something specific you had in mind?" Garrett hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "I thought we might visit a lawyer while we're there," he said. "To draw up formal adoption papers for Gabriel." Faith's breath caught. Though Garrett had been a father to Gabriel in every way that mattered since his birth, they had never formally discussed legal adoption. The suggestion touched Faith deeply, confirming what she already knew, that Garrett's commitment to them was complete and unconditional. "You want to make it official?" she asked softly. Garrett nodded, his expression serious. "I want him to be a Galloway in every sense of the word," he said, "so that no one, not Thomas, not anyone, can ever question his place in our family." Faith felt tears prick her eyes at the simple declaration. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Garrett's smile returned, lighting up his features in that way that still took her breath away. "Good," he said, seeming relieved, "because I have one more suggestion while we're in Carson City." "Oh." Faith raised an eyebrow, curious. "I thought we might also look for a new ring for you," Garrett said, his eyes dropping to her left hand, where his mother's ring still rested. "Not to replace this one, but to go alongside it. Something that's just for us for this marriage, not my past one." The thoughtfulness of the gesture overwhelmed Faith. It was as if Garrett understood exactly what she needed, an acknowledgement that their marriage, though begun as an arrangement, had become something real and precious in its own right. "I'd like that very much," she said, reaching for his hand with her free one. Garrett's fingers intertwined with hers, strong and steady. "There's something else I should tell you," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I received word yesterday from the postmaster. There was another one of those notices in the Eastern newspapers. Thomas is still looking for you." Faith tensed, instinctively holding Gabriel closer. Though months had passed without any sign that Thomas had tracked her to Nevada, the knowledge that he was still searching unsettled her deeply. "Hey," Garrett said softly, squeezing her hand. "He won't find you, and if he does, he'll have to go through me to get to either of you. You're my family now, Faith. I protect what's mine." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed Faith even as it reassured her. "I know," she said. "I trust you, Garrett." Those 3 words, "I trust you," seemed to affect Garrett profoundly. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her lips. "I've been wanting to tell you something," he said when they parted, his voice low and earnest. "I've been trying to find the right words, the right moment." Faith waited, sensing the importance of what was coming. "I love you," Garrett said simply. "Not just as my partner or Gabriel's mother, but as the woman you are. I didn't expect it, didn't plan for it, but somewhere along the way, it happened. And I wanted you to know." Though they had grown increasingly close over the past months, neither had spoken those words aloud until now. Faith felt them resonate within her, confirming what her heart had known for some time. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Not because you rescued me, not because you gave us a home, but because of the man you are. Kind, honorable, gentle, everything I never thought I'd find." Gabriel chose that moment to let out a happy gurgle, as if adding his approval to the exchange. Both Faith and Garrett laughed, the tender moment expanding to include the child, who had become the center of their shared world. As they sat together on the porch of the home, they had built not just the physical structure, but the family within it. Faith marveled at the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. She had fled in fear and desperation, carrying only hope and the child beneath her heart. She had been turned away from every door in Tanapa Junction, rejected and judged for her circumstance, except for one door. The door that had opened to reveal a solitary cowboy with green eyes and a quiet voice, who had looked at her with compassion rather than judgment, who had said two words that had changed the course of her life. Welcome home, and home it truly was. In the years that followed, Faith would sometimes tell the story to Gabriel, and later, to his siblings Rose, born a year after their trip to Carson City, and Michael, who arrived 2 years after that. She would tell them about the snowy night when a desperate woman found shelter with a kind-hearted cowboy, about the marriage that began as an arrangement but grew into a love deeper than either had imagined possible. It became a family legend of sorts, a testament to the power of compassion and second chances. And whenever Gabriel asked why his birth certificate listed Garrett as his father, Faith would tell him the simple truth. That family was not always about blood, but about love and choice and the courage to open a door when others remained closed. Garrett never spoke of Thomas, never treated Gabriel as anything less than his firstborn son. And when the children were grown and had children of their own, they would gather on the expanded porch of the homestead that had grown along with the family, listening to their grandfather tell stories of his life as a cowboy, of the woman who had arrived on his doorstep one snowy night and changed his life forever. Faith and Garrett grew old together in that house on the outskirts of Tanapa Junction, watching the small mining town transform into a bustling community as the century turned. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated bountiful harvests and family milestones, supported each other through illness and loss. Their love, born in unusual circumstances, proved as enduring as the Nevada landscape they called home. And Thomas Burnham, he never found them. His notices eventually stopped appearing in the newspapers, and whatever anger or pride had driven his search seemed to fade with time. Faith occasionally wondered what had become of him, but never regretted the path. She had chosen the path that had led her to true love and happiness with a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to say, "Welcome home."